Hey, thanks for stopping by the Carline Conversation Podcast. My name is Jason, and today I'm talking with my good friends Paddy and Melissa Flanagan. Paddy is the preaching minister for the Owens Crossroads Church of Christ, and Melissa is a graphic designer. They have 2 beautiful daughters. Our topic today is a very sensitive and unfortunately rarely discussed topic. Paddy and Melissa are gracious enough to share with me their experience with postpartum depression and anxiety. And while this topic doesn't necessarily deal with parenting our children, it's certainly a challenge that many parents face, especially new parents. And also, while everyone's experience is unique, hearing that others have struggled through something similar can often be helpful. Melissa is honest about the different emotions and pain she experienced, while Paddy gives very helpful insight from the husband's perspective. I'm so grateful to both of them for their willingness to use their experience to help others that may be going through something similar. I want to thank you as well for joining us. I hope this conversation is helpful. Paddy, Melissa, thank you guys so much for joining me today. This is a little bit different conversation than what I've had previously on the podcast, but one that I think is very important, one that doesn't get talked about a lot, and that is, of course, postpartum anxiety and postpartum depression. So thank you guys so much for being here today.
That's great to be in. Thanks.
Thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
Definitely. And I think one reason why this topic doesn't get talked about a whole lot is because it is unique. Everybody has a unique experience. Even if they have the same, PPD or PPA, then it's still definitely a unique experience to them. So would you guys mind just kind of sharing with us a little bit y'all's experience going through this?
For sure. I was explaining this to a friend the other day when I mentioned to her that we were talking about doing this podcast and just how, honestly, how nervous I was about having this conversation, not because it's one that I am scared to have, because I have it really openly often, but just because I do recognize that everyone's experience is so varied and it is so unique to them, and that we were in such a incredibly supportive system. I had a planned pregnancy. I had a husband who was 110% with me every step of the way. I had my mom who was there with me in the early days. Postpartum, and so really all the pieces and parts for me that should have made that time easier and did make that time easier were there, and I realized that for a lot of people that's not the case. And so I wanted to make sure to just really reiterate the fact that I understand that my story is such a very unique one compared to that of a lot of people. But I would say what was also really interesting about it is that kind of looking back through our excitement about being pregnant and the excitement that we had about being a family for a long time. I mean, even from before Paddy and I met when I was in middle and high school, all of my friends were the ones that were planning out their weddings and getting really excited about, who's that person going to be? And I was excited about that too, but I was the person who was writing out baby names, on napkins, envisioning, what is our family going to look like?
Let's go ahead and get on into the full family planning.
Let's do the whole thing. So, I mean, when you asked me as a kid, what do you want to be when you grow up? It was like, well, I know I want to be a mom. So I don't know, maybe a veterinarian, or, I don't know, maybe I'll do something in arts, or I could be president. That would be cool, as long as I can be a mom.
In that order, right? Yeah.
In that order. But motherhood was always the top thing. And even when we got to college, motherhood was something that came into every decision that we talked about and made when Paddy proposed and we were looking at a future together. All of the decisions that we were making about our future life together dealt with eventually wanting to be parents and what we wanted that life to look like. So when we had this great pregnancy and everything went the way that it was supposed to for 9-ish months, and then when we went into the delivery and had a little bit of difficulty in the delivery, Tilly, our firstborn, was delivered via emergency C-section, and there was a little bit of trauma that was involved in that. So when all of that happened, but everybody came out okay, and everything felt great. Those first few days, it was like, man, I'm still on cloud nine. This is like been my dream my whole life. This is what I've always wanted. Every answered prayer has led us to this moment, and here we are, and things literally couldn't be better. And I think that's why I felt so much guilt when we got home several days later after they released us from the hospital, and I couldn't shake these overwhelming feelings of hopelessness. And my rational side of my brain was not picking up. Yeah. It was not hanging. I would have these moments where it was like, what are you doing? This is literally all you've ever prayed for. She's right here. Your answered prayer is literally in your arms right now. And you're not okay. Why are you not okay? What's going on? Like, why are you sitting there saying things to yourself like, I'll never leave this chair, and I'll never be able to be with my friends again, and I'll never be able to do, like, it was just really bizarre. And so that's when we started realizing that something was off.
What, Paddy, for you going through that, what were you thinking? Like, did you feel like you were able to recognize it right out of the gate, or what was your experience going through that particular time?
So kind of tied up with what Melissa said. Obviously, I knew that was her goal going into it. She wanted to be a mom. We were all on the same page. We dated for literally ever before we got married. We're high school sweethearts, all the way through. And so it wasn't like the childbirth and everything was all like Melissa said. It was just what we wanted. But then it became obvious somewhere in there that something wasn't right anymore, and that something, like she said, you've got your answered prayer there in your hands, but then all of a sudden something's not right. And that's when it started to kind of click with me. And there were some moments that were bigger than others, and probably the biggest for me personally was it was the first Sunday I went back to church, I believe, probably a week and a half after we'd been back from the hospital. And I came home, and that was kind of the most defining moment, is when I came home the first time she'd been left by herself with Tilly, and it was that overwhelming fear and overall feeling again that she mentioned. And so that was probably the big moment for me where I realized, just in case you thought there was something, now it's confirmed that you need to talk to somebody.
So were you able to find a counselor or confide in a friend? Once you realized, okay, there's something here, what was your next step after that?
So I was really fortunate that in addition to having the friends and the family and the support system that I had, I also had a really amazing OB, I can't even say it right, OB gynecologist. She was amazing, and she was a believer, and that made a huge difference. And so Paddy and my mom came with me to the first appointment just to talk to her first and say, hey, is this what we think it is? Because we're starting to think, a couple of weeks in, we're starting to think this might be PPD. And she had us, just kind of walk her through what the last couple of weeks had been like, and some of the feelings and the emotions that I was exhibiting. And she just was such a reassuring presence in that moment, and was like, yes, that's 100% what you're going through. There are things that we can absolutely do to help. And she prayed with us in that moment, which was really cool. And I recognize, again, not everybody has that kind of a support system, but she was incredible. And so her recommendation was to first just start a very low dose of an antidepressant, which for me ended up being all that I needed. I'm the kind of person who is going to talk the ear off of any person who comes near me. So counseling would have probably not have been a bad idea, but I was already basically venting all of my things to all the people around me.
Hey,
anyway,
how are you? Well, since you asked.
Let me tell you how you're doing, how I'm doing. I'll tell you how you're doing. So it was the kind of thing where for me, starting a low dose on an antidepressant was what began the process of getting back to center and starting to get some of that rational thought back. Mm-hmm. And for me personally, it it was such a reassuring thing just to know, okay, I'm not just completely losing my mind.
Yeah.
There is actually a medical reason why my behavior is like this and why my emotions are so out of my realm of control, and why things feel so helpless and hopeless when I have an entire army of supportive friends and family around me. It was just enough to help get some of that fog to clear, and that was really important.
I feel like things like depression, anxiety and depression, outside of even with pregnancy, putting a name to it a lot of times gives people enough hope, clarity, whatever, to start that journey in the right direction. Whereas before you're just kind of looking around and you don't know where to go, but this gives you, okay, there's a name to it, and that's a big first step.
Yeah.
Sounds like that was the case as well.
It really was. It was amazing how much better I felt just leaving the office that day before I ever took any kind of medication or had any kind of additional counseling or whatever. It made such a huge difference just being able to walk out knowing, okay, we're going to try to fix this. We're going to have a way to maybe not fix it. Maybe that's not the right answer.
We're going to address this.
We're going to address it.
You're not on your own anymore.
Right.
And to me, that was the big thing, is it went from it was you on your own battling whatever was going on. And now all of a sudden your team is back in place saying, we're all going to do this together. It's your family, it's your doctors, it's everybody that's on the same page.
Yeah.
So for a family that's just had a baby, or maybe it's not even their first, and the wife in particular is just feeling this overwhelming anxiety and this hopelessness, I think was the word you used. What would be your advice to them? First of all, what are some things that they need to look for specifically? And then it sounds like the first step would be to talk to your doctor.
Yeah.
Maybe. Is that kind of what you would encourage them?
I would definitely encourage them to talk to their doctor, because there's going to be a lot of things that they will have seen that will suddenly make you feel so much more validated. And which I don't mean to use such a buzzword, but that really is how you need to feel in that moment. You really do need to know, okay, there are valid medical reasons why my hormones are going whoa and just completely bonkers. And there are things that are out of my control, and that's okay. And that's the kind of thing that a doctor can be able to help you navigate, and they'll also be able to let you know what your options are. And what worked for me may not work for everybody, but they'll at least be able to point you in the right direction. I think definitely talking to your doctor, of course, talking with your spouse about it, asking them questions like, what are you seeing in me? And trying your best, even in your most emotional and hormonal place, to be
It's also a setup question, I feel like.
Yeah.
How does this dress make me look? You're wonderful.
Right. Yeah. Because I know that really puts the husband on pins and needles to feel like they carry some of that responsibility because they don't want to make it worse. And I know that's something that any partner in a relationship with a spouse that's going through some sort of anxiety or depression feels. They don't want to cause anything that's going to make it a more difficult situation than it already is. But you know your spouse inside and out better than anyone else. And a lot of times it's the spouse that's going to recognize there's a problem for real before the person who's exhibiting those symptoms may even notice.
I mean, that'd be my big thing. Obviously, the knowing your spouse is the most important thing. You had a child with this person. Hopefully, you know each other very well. And so make sure that you know that. But also, I think having some of these discussions, this is why Melissa and I love to talk about this so much, is just because we felt like nobody had this discussion with us ahead of time. We had never really heard a lot of this stuff, and we hadn't talked about it ahead of time. So talking before your actual pregnancy, before the birth of the child, having these discussions with one another of, hey, this is something to look out for, and then especially being there for other people. And that's kind of been one of the things we've tried to do. As we realized less people were having this conversation, we decided everybody we know who's having a kid, that we're close to, we're going to let them know, hey, this is something you need to look out for, and don't feel bad reaching out to us about it or asking questions, because I didn't feel like we heard a lot. Maybe you did, but I didn't feel like anyone ever talked to me about that.
This feels like one of those things that you don't hear about until you're completely in the middle of it.
Yeah.
You know, until it's too late to have been prepared at all.
Right. That's how I felt.
So like as the husband, I'm really intrigued myself, being a husband, you know, what are some things that you tried to do, and especially in ministry, we like to fix things. We like to feel like we can, you know, positively impact any situation. But sometimes we can end up doing more harm than good. But what are some things that you found were helpful? What are some things that you found not to do, maybe? I don't know which list is longer, but
to me, the helpful thing was it comes down to knowing your spouse and seeing what are some of those things that can help. Because what worked for me and us may not work for everybody else, obviously. But kind of Melissa kind of already indicated she had this feeling that she was just going to be trapped, that she was just stuck in the chair at home, whatever it was. She'd never do something again. And so one of the very first things I did was I took Tilly, our oldest, and wrapped her up in that Moby wrap. I don't know if you've seen those. Wrapped her up in a Moby wrap. And this is the day we got home, and took her for a walk around the neighborhood just to get her out and to give Melissa some breathing space. And that was really before we even recognized there was a lot, but there was already a recognized need to get a little bit of that space. Yeah. And that ended up kind of being a trend throughout this, is me just stepping up and saying, you know what, I'm going to take her to Target with me. You know, just me and the kid. And you don't see a lot of dads with like 10-day-old, babies at Target. I don't even know if you're supposed to take them out at 10 days old. But we did.
Your secret's safe here. I won't tell
That's right. But just taking her out myself and taking those moments to give Melissa some space. And that seemed to be a really early on something that worked. And so walks around the neighborhood, taking her to stores, just going out, getting out in the car and that type of thing. Back when you could drive and it didn't cost you an arm and a leg just to drive around town.
Yeah.
One of the things that I want to be sure to touch on with that as well, because I don't think he'll speak as candidly about it, but we had a lot of difficulty nursing, like a lot. This was our first baby, and there were a lot of things that I just assumed were going to come naturally that were not happening naturally for me or for her. And it was so beyond frustrating. I felt a lot of that guilt that we talked about earlier. There was all of this feeling of, well, you know, is my body just not working the way that it's supposed to? We had lactation consultants that would try to help. We had friends that were just really great at it that would try to come over and help and whatever. But we would run into situations where I would try to nurse for 45 minutes to an hour, not realizing that Tilly wasn't really latching very well and getting enough. And so 15 minutes later, she'd be hungry again, and we'd be right back in that place. And so
that's exhausting,
it was
physically and emotionally.
It was a lot. It was a lot. And there were a lot of things that he probably felt like he couldn't do, because in that situation
there are some limitations there.
There are some limitations there, but what he would do is those evenings in the night, especially like the middle of the night feedings and stuff, when I would go into her room and she'd be crying and I'd pick her up and I would be trying to nurse her, he would walk in there with me a lot of nights and just lay on the floor. He would just physically be a presence in that space, in that time, even when it was exhausting for him, even when that was something that was going to, you know, be difficult for him at work the next day. He would physically be there, and half the time he'd be asleep. But it was at least like, you know, just he would be cuddled up.
Still giving you credit, just to clarify.
That's right, yeah. But he would be physically like there on the floor. I have pictures of him like laying on Tilly's rug with her big stuffed pink bear sleeping covered up in, you know, one of her swaddle blankets while I'm in there trying to nurse. But he was just, it was just his quiet ways of trying to let me know you're not here alone. And that was really, really helpful.
Yeah, that's big. You've mentioned multiple times you've got a great support system. You had multiple layers of help and support. What can some people do if they think something's wrong? They're not in your inner circle. You know, they're not immediate family maybe, or that best friend, but someone that just notices something is up. What are some things that they can do to be helpful, and what are some things that they probably shouldn't do, or they do or say that are well-meaning, but ultimately, you know, or do a little bit more damage than help?
Yeah, this is such a hard question, to be honest, because I do recognize that things that would be endearing to me might to someone else be like, oh, yeah, I can't believe, you know, someone approached me about this. But things that were really helpful to me were those really sweet folks that just said, hey, can can I hold her for you for a moment? If we were at church, can I hold her for a little bit, while you go to class, or while you're, while you go to the bathroom, or even just things like, hey, if you need anything, we are always happy to watch her for you for a few minutes so you can get a shower, or you can go to Target, or, whatever. Like, it was the kind of thing that I rarely actually followed up with, because there are definitely people that you feel more comfortable opening up to for sure than others. But I think just knowing that people cared and that they were just aware that it was a difficult transition going from not having, this beautiful child to now having said beautiful child at a time where things are starting to look more visibly difficult. It was a little different for us too, because at the time we were in youth ministry. And so we had a lot of families that already, honestly, I felt like they kind of practically raised us, to be honest. And so a lot of these moms that had kids that were teens, I think they recognized things that I didn't even know were happening around me. But they would say, hey, we'll do babysitting nights for you guys. You just drop her off. Don't even worry. We've got a whole army of kids at our disposal at home, and we would love to take this child.
These are good families that you could trust, and you've already got that relationship built in. I think that was the key.
Yeah.
I think maybe Katie and Abby coming over, these are people who were already in our lives who, when they just show up and say, hey, I'm going to be here, let you take a shower type thing, you totally trust them already. Yeah. And you got to have those built-in relationships. And that's again, what's so unique about our situation is we felt like we had every single thing we needed. And we still had to go through this and we still dealt with it. But at the same time, we recognize a lot of people don't have those type of supports built in for whatever reason, whether whether they chose it or not, or they're just in a bad situation. But trying to have those type things really did help.
Yeah, I would encourage folks listening that if they don't already have a church family, that's a huge blessing. And even if you are connected to a church, what I'm hearing you say was very similar to our experience of, because we were also in youth ministry for a long time, having close friends that are a stage or two ahead of you in life.
Yes.
And so that they can see, like you said, they recognize some things, but they also have wisdom to share and experience to share. I think that's a big deal, is to have balance in your relationships. Some people older that invest in you, and those that are younger that you can invest in. And that definitely gives balance to life and a whole nother level of accountability. And specifically in the church, what are some things that, based on y'all's experience, that you feel like the churches in general need to be able to do or can do? How can the church basically be a place for healing for parents?
I think just having a very sorry, I was about to say something, and then I kind of caught myself. I think most churches nowadays, I think they really do try to understand. I think most people now within churches are starting to kind of come to that place of understanding of, we want to be as supportive to young parents as we can, because they recognize it's just a phase. It's just a little, honestly, it doesn't last forever, but it is such an important one, and it is such a pivotal one in that family's life. Yeah. And I think most congregations are starting to realize now we take care of our families, and we're taking care of our church in a really big way. We're taking care of those babies by making sure that those moms understand that we want them there. We want them there. I think every once in a while we'll see things circulate on social media about, someone will make kind of a snide comment about babies being distractions in church. And, people will say things that come across horribly. And I have a feeling most of the time those people have no idea that what they're saying, makes the impact that it does. But I think most people far and wide now really do recognize the blessing it is to have babies at church, to have young families there, to have those noises, those distractions. They're just a reminder that the church is continuing and that God's family is growing. And, that's such a big deal. And so I would say just trying to have an understanding and I don't know, just a gentle
It's more
way of loving on them, making sure they know that they're welcome.
Yeah, you may not have all the physical spaces. You got to think, not every congregation is going to have as big of a physical space as this, where you all have so many resources. But at the same time, just finding ways to use what you have and make it welcoming to parents and young people. And not just that. I mean, obviously, we should be doing that for every phase of life. But these major transition phases in life, this is one of those where I think it's going to be a make or break moment for a lot of parents. Because, we had people up in Tennessee who there was a moment where they both looked at each other and they said, "Why are we even here?" And while I happen to see that moment, a lot of people don't. A lot of church leaders don't. Where somebody in their flock is wondering, "Why am I even here?" Because I'm tucked off in this weird corner all by myself. And so use what you can and be supportive. And I think from a leadership standpoint, I think Melissa hit it first all on the head. I don't think most churches say, problems with kids. I really don't think that that's a thing. I've never really seen that myself, but I would say to everyone who's listening also realize, your role in this as a church member, as someone in the pew, because it doesn't matter in my mind if I stand up there and I'm preaching and a baby's going nuts in the audience and I don't, because I'll joke with it, not like in a make the parent feel bad. I'll tell them I'm glad they're there type thing, and I'll tell them afterwards I'm glad they're there, and I try to be very welcoming, probably because my kids are louder than most kids anyway.
Yes.
And so I get
that. Baby amens are the best ones. They're the cutest amens.
That's right. You get it.
Our kids are probably being the worst ones in there at the time.
But it also to understand, in the way we do things, and most churches of Christ do things, anybody, you don't know who's going to be up there after or before leading a prayer or doing communion, and you have the ability to set that tone right or wrong either when you're up there, and also in the pew. When you're in a pew and there's a kid behind you who's losing their mind, if you turn around every time, it's not going to make that parent feel better. It's okay. We have a child who always gets loose during the sermon. And I love it. It keeps me entertained. I feel bad for everybody else because I'm entertained because I love it. I think it's the greatest thing ever because I'm just glad you're here type thing.
Yeah.
They're really trying hard. But realize that if you'll use that, if you have a kid who's running through, and we've had that with our kid once before in the middle of Lord's Supper, who just decided in that prayer they're going to sprint to the literal other side of the auditorium, that your reaction as a church member can make that parent feel welcome or unwelcome really quick, and can be a defining moment. May not be, but it can be a very defining moment where they say, "Look, I'm out," type of a thing. Especially now where everyone's virtual anyway, it's a really easy reason to just slide out and stay virtual.
Yeah, that's a difficult thing to navigate from a church leadership standpoint, and it's really about trying to build a culture in your congregations.
That's right.
And I think COVID, since we mentioned that, forced us to really evaluate, are we connected by a mutual appointment each week, or are we actually in each other's lives? And I think that gets to the heart of this, is having people that you welcome into your life and that you are in their lives on an intimate level. That's what the church did in the first century that we saw, in Scripture.
And that's why really it's hard for me to imagine navigating postpartum depression and anxiety without a church family. And I know there's so many people that do. I just don't know how they do it. I really don't. And I do think that a large amount of my successful exit from navigating that came from that kind of assistance, came from that kind of love and acceptance and family, and just being able to know and have that reassurance that I've got this amazing group of people who are supporting us as a family and are just as invested in the well-being of my baby and my family as I am, really. I mean, that was a huge, huge thing. And that's not the kind of thing you can really manufacture.
Right.
But it is a plea, for people to, before you are in a committed relationship, before you are planning a family, definitely seek out those mentors, seek out those relationships, have those built in, just for your own well-being. I mean, beyond, for this. I mean, just because that's what the whole church family is all about anyway.
The cliche is, it takes the village to raise, and cliches are cliches, but it's because there's some truth there.
Yeah.
And I think that one is definitely true for every generation. We definitely need that extra support, and our kids need layered examples of godliness in their life, and that's one way to do that.
For sure.
I have one more question about, so Tilly was your first. How did you approach the second pregnancy, having gone through that experience? Did you do things differently? Were you try to navigate the second pregnancy differently? What was the difference in those two?
So it's a little bit complicated because about a month before we were due to have our second Molly, not our second Molly, but our second child named Molly. That would be funny if we just had two Mollys after Tilly. We found out that my dad was diagnosed with a terminal illness. And so in addition to the wanting to be proactive for PPD, I was also recognizing we're going to be dealing with a very real other reason to be grieving. And so we were having, at that point in pregnancy, we were having multiple visits with our OB a month at that time. And so as soon as we found out what was going on there, I sat down with her again and let her know, basically what we were going to be dealing with for the next year. And I told her, I want to be as proactive about this as possible. If you feel like I need to go ahead and start on some sort of antidepressant, anti-anxiety, some sort of a medication to help bypass some of that, I'm going to do whatever you want me to do, because it was such a huge help the last time we dealt with this. And again, she was the kind of person who prayed with me about it. We talked about our options. We ultimately decided that soon as that sweet baby came out, they were going to start running me a nice little IV of Zoloft. And so that was what was really helpful for me. And honestly, again, because I had such a great support system where I was already actively praying with other friends, talking to them about what to look out for with me. I by that point, I knew to say, hey guys, if I start saying things like, I will never be able to blah, blah, blah again, if I start saying things like, I don't know how I'm going to make it, or I don't know how any of this ultimately works out. If I start saying some of these things again, you'll know things have not
these are flags.
Quite, some of these are some red flags, but we were much more prepared the second time, and that made a world of difference going into it. It's hard.
And that was a big deal, because the first time it felt like everything was just right going into it. And the second time, with everything going on with your dad, it felt like it felt at the moment like everything was going wrong. And so having that already, having those discussions and getting ahead of it, I think really did help.
Yeah, I think so too. There was a difference in the two deliveries too, which made a difference as well. Because the first time with Dilly, we had a couple of false alarms where we thought we were going to deliver. Contractions were doing all the things contractions are supposed to do. And then we'd get to the hospital and they're like, oh, sorry, guys. It's just not time. And so I labored for several days. I was in back labor for it was Labor Day weekend, which is ironic.
Yeah. It's the most ironic.
It's the worst. But it made it worse because no doctors were in on Monday. And so we waited until that following Tuesday to go back into the doctor. And I was dying, not literally dying, but I felt like I was dying. And they started looking at numbers, and they started looking at Tilly, and they got a little nervous. He probably knew they were more nervous than I recognized that they were in that moment. But her oxygen levels were not doing what they needed to do, and her heart rate was up. And so they immediately decided they were going to do an induction. And we went through that for 10 hours or more before we got all the way up to where we were supposed to be able to deliver. And they were like, nope, she's tanking, we got to go. And so we had that emergency C-section. And there were just a lot of things about even some of the trauma of that, oh my goodness, what if we lose her? That feeling of, it never occurred to me that something could have happened to me in that moment. Really, like, I was high-fiving all the nurses and trying to be like super cheerleader to then like just get my kid out of here safe. Like that's the only thing that matters. But like coming out of just that, you know, that in and of itself was pretty wild, and the healing and everything that had to take place after that. But it was so different with Molly the second time, because the second time, not only were we trying to be more proactive, because of some of the difficulty that happened with Tilly's delivery, I had just already told my OB, hey, you know what? I have zero pride in how this sweet kid gets out of me. Let's just do another C-section, a planned one this time, because I just don't want anything to happen to her. I don't want anything, you know, out of my control in this situation. Not that I had any control over it, honestly. Anyway, but just within my realm of ability to choose was let's go ahead and do this in a planned manner. So we can go ahead and start medication, so we can go ahead and start that process of healing, and it'll be a lot easier on my body knowing what we're about to go through than it will going the other way. And so for us, that was part of how we decided to navigate it. And I felt like it really did make a emotional difference for me, just having a plan and being able to just have that understanding of we're being proactive and we're going to do this together this time.
How does something like that impact your faith, your relationship with God?
I would say, if anything, it's strengthened it. I used that word control a minute ago, and then I caught myself, because the truth is I love to convince myself I have control over things.
Control, the perception of
I love to think that I have more control than I really do. And there's a lot of honestly, parenthood in general is the recognition, I think, of how little control we really have. Once a part of you is now running around out in the world, and you're like, oh Lord, please do take care of this part of my heart that has now left my body and is out there in the world. But no, it has really strengthened my faith, at least. He provided for our family in such paramount and monumental ways. And even in those moments where things did feel so hopeless, there was a recognition inside of me that something's not right with me, because that's where my mind is. I had never had a moment where I did truly feel hopeless before, because so much of my understanding of what God has in store for me goes so far beyond this life that hopelessness didn't even really register with me for a long time. And so when I started having a lot of those feelings, and I started hearing myself saying certain phrases and thinking certain things that felt so foreign to that, it really did set off a red flag of, hey, something's not right here. But no, I felt like it taught me a lot about the reality that I don't have control. And sometimes I don't even have control over my own emotions. And that felt very scary. But it was a reality check, and it was a important thing for me to learn. And it was an important thing for me to feel, in that I feel like now I can so much better empathize with people that deal with mental illness in general. And I can understand things that maybe I used to think or never would have actually said, but I might have thought to myself, like, well, why can't you just not? Why can't you see all the good things in front of you and appreciate them? Why can't you just choose good, differently than what you're doing in this moment, and realizing now that sometimes, man, would they do that? Man, wouldn't they? If they could just flip that switch, buddy, they sure would. But that's just not a reality.
Right. What other messages of hope and encouragement would you offer new parents or parents that are going through this, maybe that have gone through it multiple times. What kind of encouragement would you offer to them?
I would say that there are so many wonderful people that want to lift you up, that want to encourage you, that want to be the support that you need. Sometimes they just don't know what you need. But there is absolutely hope. There is absolutely a family that wants to support you through God's church. That there are so many wonderful, believing doctors and counselors and friends and family members that want to be what you need in those moments where you feel alone. And that even though everyone's story is so different and everyone's situation can be so unique, there are just so many resources now that are available and openly talked about that I don't think existed. Or maybe if they did exist, they weren't as available or weren't as openly talked about, decades ago, that now are available, that are so easy to do and are so much more discreet. I think, for those people that do still feel that stigma, for the people that do still feel like they don't want people to know that there's a problem, if that's you and you're like, I don't want, to be on a podcast somewhere telling somebody
Podcast is not for everybody,
about this. If that's you, that there are ways to handle it in a discreet way that are still very helpful. But I would still encourage people, even if you are the kind of person who doesn't wear your heart on your sleeve and you're the kind of person who doesn't openly share all of your feelings with everyone all the time, that the more open and honest and vulnerable you can be about these feelings with the people who love you is going to benefit you in really big ways. And I would say that for anybody that needs to hear it, I did go on an antidepressant both times with both pregnancies. And then I came off of it both times with both pregnancies. There are a lot of people that's not their story. And maybe they're still in counseling a couple years out, or maybe they're still on some form of medication, years outside of having their deliveries, but they're living and they are happy and they are thriving and they are still just as loved by God in that state, in that place, as someone who came out and isn't having to have that type of medical help at this stage of the game. And I would just say that, even if that's your story and you're still needing assistance years from now, that's okay.
Yeah. I'll say this too. From my perspective, the guy being there, being present, I would hope this is all automatic stuff, that the dads would be there, they'd be present, they'd be helpful, they'd be doing all the things. So just remind yourself, guys, that even if, yes, you have to go to work the next day, like Melissa, even if you have to go to work the next day, you can still lose some sleep. It's okay. You'll survive. You will. And if I can, just briefly speak directly to the church leaders, because that's a unique side of this. Thinking about your audience, there may be youth ministers and other ministers and people who are in church work who are in this. We don't have set up policies ahead of time. Maybe y'all do here, but we didn't, even at Concord Road. A great congregation with a lot of things going on, but there seems to be less consistency. But my elders were wonderful. When I reached out to them and said, hey, something's up with Melissa, we need to address this. They were really good about that. But at the same time, I think it'd be great for places to proactively say, by the way, and this is way ahead, way before your person's ever pregnant or their wife's ever pregnant, is saying, hey, by the way, this is having an idea so that it's laid out. And then always, of course, and I know every church leader would do this, but also having that compassionate side of, and, here's our set policy, but let us know if you need more time, or something else happens. But at least knowing ahead of time what that is, because even with our situation, like I said, it was great. A lot of businessmen who were elders, and they all had their own policies, but there's nothing set. And so I kind of felt this pressure of, well, should I be back? Should I not be back? No one's told me yes or no. So then it's on me. And I think if the church leaders, whatever situation of a church you're in, if they could just say, hey, here's what we think is right, but please, if something pops up, don't feel bad about it.
Yeah, just to have a relationship where you can approach the topic in some places, unfortunately, is, too intimidating to do. But again, that kind of goes back to that culture element of to have a relationship, to be able to communicate. I think that's great advice.
Yeah, your church is more than just a place to hold you a shower before you have a child. It is a place to already be connected and plugged in, and to already have those multi-generational relationships up and down, so that whatever pops up in your life, it's already there. It's not just a panic place, and that's something you can't get as easily outside of the church.
Yeah. I can't thank you guys enough. This is a very sensitive topic, and of course, everyone will have their own experience. But if someone is going through this or knows of someone going through this, and they would like to reach out to you, to get in touch with you, to maybe ask some more questions and share with their personal experience, what are some places they can find you online, or how can they get in touch with you?
They can always find us on Facebook. Facebook's pretty easy. You can drop a message, friend request, or a message and let us know. That'd be probably the easiest way.
Good deal. Well, thank you guys again for joining me today, and thank you guys for joining us on the Carline Conversations. We hope today's conversation has been helpful. Hey, thanks again so much for listening to this episode of the Carline Conversation Podcast. If it's been helpful to you, please follow and subscribe on whatever platform you're listening. It also helps if you'll take a moment to rate the show. It goes a long way to growing the podcast. If you have any thoughts you'd like to share or suggestions for future topics or guests, feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, or email. Thanks again for stopping by, and we'll see you on the next episode of Carline Conversations.